Mussolini was finally freed by an SS special squad, and later he was installed by Hitler as leader of the Italian Social Republic. On the 14th of September 1943, Hitler received the freed Mussolini at FHQ Wolfschanze. Everybody paraded on the airfield at Rastenburg to greet him, and the Duce was apparently very touched by the entire event. He shook the hand of every man of the bodyguard very heartily, as if we were old acquaintances from whom he had been long parted. The atmosphere was, in any case, always special when Mussolini visited Hitler. There was no other meeting with a politician that compared to it. The two of them would actually have an almost friendly conversation. Otto Skorzeny, the SS officer who had been behind the liberation of Mussolini, was also at FHQ Wolfschanze that autumn day. He celebrated amply. I met him as he left the officers' mess, making his way through many handshakes by colleagues. He even shook my hand in elation. The liberation of Mussolini provided only a brief excuse to celebrate. Along the whole Eastern Front, the Soviets had taken the initiative and did not let it up again. The situation became ever more threatening. My colleagues had intense discussions about every report from the front. He and his wife called by my flat to thank me. I asked him about his experiences at the concentration camp, but he avoided the question, saying only that the worst thing had been the paper shirts the inmates were made to wear. Despite all my inquiries, I could get nothing out of him. Never in my presence did he ever say anything about what befell him there, neither shortly after his release nor later. I was at the Berghof from April to July 1943. It was not such a carefree time as it has been the previous year. Hitler surrounded himself only with his intimate circle and met the most important Axis statesmen primarily at Schloss Klesheim. Besides Mussolini and Horthy, he received representatives from Norway, Slovakia, King Boris of Bulgaria, Ion Antonescu of Romania, and the French politician Pierre Laval. The times when the Berghof would be filled with a large number of guests, including those from Eva's circle of friends, were past. Visits by the Speers were still very well received. Hitler continued to enjoy his conversations with Albert Speer on questions of architecture and city planning. One might suspect that the Allied air raids were nothing more than welcome demolition work for all the wonderful new city buildings that the pair were developing. Hitler found in Speer his ideal counterpart, a man capable of embracing his visions and turning them into what he had in mind in this area. Whenever Hitler and the building's Inspector General were engrossed in their plans and drawings, Hitler was usually in a good mood. For his ability to cheer Hitler up, we of the bodyguard valued Speer, but otherwise he seemed to us to be a really queer fish, even a little crazy as artists tend to be. At the beginning of July, Hitler returned to FHQ Wolfschanze. At the same time, the major summer offensive in the east, codenamed Zitadelle, began, and I got some leave. The choice of where to go I had made some time previously, Niedersee in Masuria. I met my wife in Berlin, and we took the night train to Rastenburg. Earlier I had informed my colleagues about our arrival, so somebody from the FHQ Wolfschanze motor pool fetched us from the railway station and took us to Niedersee. The driver returned to FHQ Wolfschanze, leaving Gerda and myself to spend 2 weeks holidaying in the region, which I had reconnoitred for that purpose on my many car excursions with my colleagues. We took boat trips, went swimming a lot, and enjoyed the amenities of our hotel, in which, incidentally, a troupe of well-known German actors were resting, among them the great René Deltgen. As we discovered, a UFA film was being shot in the area. At the end of the 2 weeks, our holiday was at an end, and the summer offensive had come to grief. The Soviet breach of the German southern front, the Kursk elbow, had not been repulsed. Now, on all fronts on Soviet territory, the retreat began. I went back with Gerda to Berlin, spent the last week of my leave there, and celebrated my 26th birthday. Then I returned to FHQ Wolfschanze and caught up with what had happened during my leave. Without exception, it was bad news. Allied troops had landed in Sicily, Operation Husky. Mussolini had been deposed and arrested on the order of King Victor Emmanuel III. There had been a coup in Italy and a devastating 1,000-bomber air raid done on Hamburg, which had reduced the city to rubble and ashes. The mood was edgy. Hitler railed endlessly against the Luftwaffe, calling for an immediate strengthening of the flak and air defences. At the beginning of September, Italy capitulated. Hitler did not have a good word to say about Italian soldiers. They were a mixture of the best and the worst. He considered German and French soldiers to be the most capable. He allowed that Britain was the only nation that could run colonies successfully. In passing, I picked up that Hitler had had Prince Philip of Hesse, the son-in-law of the King of Italy, arrested. The directory sailed over my head and landed on the table beyond me. Just look for Heilig. What for? Look! Eagerly he flicked through another directory. There were lots of subscribers called Heilig. Karl tapped his finger on another surname. Abend. We grinned. We needed to make a number of calls before the people rung announced their surnames together, and we obtained the desired Heilig Abend. A man's voice first. Here is Heilig. Then a woman. Abend. Herr Heilig reacted gruffly. What do you want then? But you called me. Don't talk nonsense, you called me. In Berlin, to warn her. This advance information was naturally of great value. Above all, however, it gave one a feeling of being underhand, but in the anxiety one had for one's family also provided a comforting feeling of safety. Many incidents would have seemed trifling in peacetime. On the way to lunch in the officers' mess, I could hardly believe my eyes. Wasn't that Heinz Rühmann coming towards me? Quacks, the pilot who always crashed. Yes, it definitely was him. I had no idea what he was doing at FHQ Wolfschanze, and neither did my colleagues. It was not the case that we of the SS bodyguard would be informed especially of such visitors. Not until later did I discover that Rühmann had shown his new film, Die Feuerzangenbowle, here, because the Ministry of Propaganda had a problem with it, and the matter had to be decided at the highest level. Whether Rühmann showed the film to Hitler personally, I do not know. Anyway, I never saw the two of them together. At the beginning of November 1943, we boarded the special train at Rastenburg for Munich, where on the 8th of November Hitler made his annual speech in the Bürgerbraukeller, in remembrance of the martyrs of the movement. This would be the last speech on the anniversary of the 1923 attempted putsch. Belief in final victory was no longer unshakable. The war is lost. In the autumn of 1943, the phrase escaped from even Hitler's mouth. I did not hear it myself, but it spread like wildfire. The colleague who told me said that Hitler had not uttered it in conversation, but more to himself, as if he were telling himself. New strategies and technical developments were always coming to the forefront, with great hopes attached. I was especially impressed by a display of new aircraft on the airfield at Insterburg, today Cherniakovsk, near FHQ Wolfschanze. The pilots were introduced to Hitler in the presence of General Jodl 19 and manufacturer Ernst Heinkel. Then the trio stationed themselves up on the hangar, while I stood with two colleagues near the apron. The display began with the 6-engined Ju 390 and some 4-engined Blohm and Voss machines. The Ju 390 had a range of more than 10,000 kilometers without refueling. The aircraft played their war games in the sky and were replaced by a couple of night fighters. After that, 2 jet aircraft took off. Their flight path could only be followed briefly before the clouds swallowed them up. Finally came the high point of the display, a rocket fighter. A major took his leave of Hitler and climbed into a capsule on a firing ramp. Hinged cockpit lid up, lid closed. My colleagues and I stared at the capsule, fascinated and expectant. Suddenly we heard an explosion, a deafening noise, and the capsule was on its way. For some time nothing happened. Somewhere there was a sound like thunder, but nothing could be seen in the direction from which it came. Long before the thunder, a large triangular object had swept past us, slowly losing height. It rocked left and right like a gigantic bat. Not 50 meters from us, it set down on its skid and inclined slightly to one side. The capsule was not opened at once, but a tractor arrived to tow the machine with its occupant still inside into the hangar. I was impressed. Special warnings about secrecy were not issued, even on occasions like this. Heilig Abend and 2 rendezvous. Around Christmas 1943, it was relatively quiet. Hitler was at FHQ Werwolf, while my duties kept me at the Reich Chancellery. On Heiligabend, Christmas Eve, there were 3 of us on the telephone, and we were bored. There was little work, and we had received information that no Allied air raids were expected for the coming hours. We began to joke and fool around with the switchboard. Suddenly, Karl Weichelt seized the telephone directory. "I have a suitably festive idea." The directory sailed over my head and landed on the table beyond me. "Just look for Heilig." "What for?" "Look." Eagerly he flicked through another directory. There were lots of subscribers called Heilig. Karl tapped his finger on another surname. Abend. We grinned. We needed to make a number of calls before the people rung announced their surnames together, and we obtained the desired Heilig Abend. A man's voice first. "Here is Heilig." Then a woman. "Abend." Herr Heilig reacted gruffly. "What do you want then?" "But you called me?" "Don't talk nonsense, you called me." At first the pair of them were quite indignant, but then the man began to suspect a prank. We listened in to the conversation discreetly and became the witnesses to a small telephone flirtation. Karl could not believe it. "Man, they're still talking." The conversation went on for half an hour, and at the end of it they arranged to meet. Herr Heilig said he would bring along the provisions intended for his brother in France, and Frau Abend promised to bake a cake. Who had brought them together they had no idea. At the end of the war there was no fresh fruit to be had anywhere. Shortly after the dismissal of Frau Scharfitzel, Hitler ordered that at every meal only 2 pats of butter were to be distributed at each place. Herr Lange later ran his own restaurant, the Kurfürstendamm in Berlin. When I visited him long after the war with my wife, he remembered immediately. "Liver with onions." Yes, that was my favourite dish, and Lange prepared it for me that evening in celebration of our reunion. The diet cook Frau von Exner was, as mentioned, a very beautiful woman. That had not escaped Martin Bormann. The nickname the Buck Bormann had not come about by chance. Anyway, Bormann went all out for Frau von Exner, but failed utterly. When she left in 1944, we of the bodyguard thought it must have had something to do with these attempts to woo her. It was said that Frau von Exner had requested permission to leave, and that could only have been caused by the pressure. She did not have proof of Aryan ancestry, but her departure had nothing to do with that. In any case, after the termination of her employment as cook, she lived for several months at the Reich Chancellery. I often reflected later on whether I had ever noticed that Hitler hated Jews. Then I remembered Frau von Exner and did not know the right answer. The mood of Christmas cheer was soon gone. Incessant bad reports followed. The situation on the Eastern Front was more worrying every day. Hitler's order of holdout at all costs could not be complied with. In the south, the Soviets had broken through to the Bug, and now troops were being withdrawn from there in order to stop the Allied invasion in Italy. Hitler wanted to use all available forces to prevent the advance of the Allies from their landing point at Anzio. In mid-February, we moved to the Berghof. FHQ Wolfschanze was meanwhile being expanded and made safer against possible air raids. This work was again done by Organisation Todt. New bunkers were built, and the roof thickness of the Führerbunker was increased to 7 meters. Before we reached the Berghof, Hitler stopped off in Munich to meet Gerdi Troost. We went to the Führerbau, where Frau Troost led Hitler through an exhibition. She handled questions on the inner architecture of many government buildings. Hitler had once lived at a house in Prinzregentstrasse 16, where a Frau Winter still kept 2 of the 6 bedrooms, which he had rented long ago, available for him. The rooms were on the 2nd floor. We of the bodyguard were 2 staircases higher up. Apart from her exhibition of panzers, aircraft and automobiles, I had little interest in Frau Troost's field of activity, and I made no attempt to follow her and Hitler into the exhibition room, but remained in the reception hall. I passed the time in conversation with the female cloakroom attendant. She mentioned that she would like to meet me after duty for a glass of wine, but I had to decline regretfully, because I would still be on duty and have to accompany the Führer when he left that evening. Finally, Hitler reappeared, and just as he was passing her, to my horror, she said, "I would like to go out with him this evening." "Here," she pointed at me, "but he says he will be on duty." Hitler looked around for our commander. Gesche, Gesche. Misch has the evening free. After the boss had therefore forced me, I did take the girl out for dinner and then returned to my colleagues. I was naturally surprised by Hitler's reaction, even more by the fact that he remembered my name. Since entering his service in 1940, he had perhaps called me Misches only twice, but he had never forgotten my name, for his famously good memory served him well. Philanderer Bormann. The following day we arrived at the Berghof. To protect against Allied air raids, something special had been dreamed up. If there was an air raid over Bavaria, the entire Berchtesgaden Valley was to be concealed in artificial smoke. Smoke barrels had been set up, which would envelop the whole area in a thick soup within minutes. Over the next few weeks, the usual clique assembled at the Berghof. Among them were SS General Sepp Dietrich, Professor Morell, Diplomat Huell, the Spears, and of course Martin Bormann. Of all these people, I only really liked Huell. He was always in a good mood and had excellent social manners. Hitler was Zabelling again. We invented the verb for the local Zabel sanatorium, named after Professor Werner Zabel, and which prepared Hitler's diet. He stuck to his regimen with an iron will. Nothing and nobody could deflect him from his oatmeal gruel and the repellent rest, which he himself decreed for his stomach problems. I myself, no stranger to such problems, did not have this discipline. I just needed a proper diet. Apart from the special Zabel cures, Hitler's dietary plan was not very varied. He employed his own diet cook. In 1944 there was a lot of interest in Marlene von Exner, a rather austere-looking but attractive young woman of my age. Hitler had got her from Antonescu after he told Hitler on a visit that only this Viennese woman had been able to control his own stomach problems. Frau von Exner then replaced Hitler's former female cook, Scharfitzel, whom House Administrator Kannenberg had dismissed one day on suspicion of misappropriating food supplies. Because food had long been on ration, Scharfitzel's target had been the butter. Well, yes, even I helped myself now and again from the large tub with iced water, in which many small lumps of butter floated, but it equalled itself out because I supplied Hitler with apples. One day I had received a basket of apples from my Aunt Sophia, but had to go back to the Reich Chancellery. Aunt Sophia was working at that time in a tree improvement business. When I left the apples briefly in the kitchen, the cook Herr Lang came running up delighted. "Just leave them here." From then until late in the war, I was therefore Hitler's apple supplier. On the 3rd of June 1944, Eva Braun's sister Gretel married Major General Hermann Fegelein. The festivities were held on the Obersalzberg. Fegelein had been the Waffen-SS liaison officer to Hitler since the beginning of the year, and had, as one heard, distinguished himself in the field. Above all, however, Fegelein was a daredevil, braggart, pretentious, boorish ape, for whom women fell one after another. Eva, herself not without tangible feelings for the heartbreaker, coupled him up to her younger sister Gretel. On the night of the 5th of June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy began. Hitler was not informed until midday on the 6th of June. He believed for quite some time that it could be halted. When it quickly became clear that the coastal sectors could not be held, he became absolutely convinced that the whole operation was connected to treason. He saw himself confirmed in this opinion when, some weeks later, photos were released in Sweden, in which a German colonel commanding an Abwehr-fortified bunker installation was seen clinking glasses with 2 British officers, obviously without a shot having been fired. Damn! How could they have given up without a fight? They had guns there which could have hit Plymouth, so we were told. Nothing, absolutely nothing, had gone right on the German side in connection with the invasion. There was, therefore, only one explanation: treason and sabotage. Hitler imagined it behind almost every action that failed. In fact, from the information coming into us, it actually was possible to perceive that something of that kind was often the case. Now we began to receive reports more frequently of sabotage in sectors of armaments production. There were constant altercations with the Wehrmacht command staff, and Hitler did not exclude even Jodl and Keitel from his suspicions of manipulation. I knew many of Hitler's moods, but he always remained friendly towards me. As the war situation deteriorated, however, I also no longer believed in final victory. Under the pressure of this mood impregnated with distrust, on the 22nd of June 1944, Hitler addressed 280 high-ranking officers and generals on the Platterhof. It was very moving. Hitler implored them to show their unity and their loyalty as German officers. If they left him in the lurch, no longer believed in victory, no longer gave their all, then Germany was lost. Victory or defeat, that lay in their hands, not in his. If they wanted to give it up, how would he operate the rudder alone? Hitler was several times close to tears. The speech moved me very much. I really felt sorry for Hitler. On the evening of that June day, I saw the popular General Eduard Dietl at the Berghof, who gave Hitler the up-to-date picture of the situation in Norway and Finland. The following day I learnt that Dietl's aircraft had crashed at Semmering near Vienna, and all aboard had been killed. I was very upset at the news. Because of the situation on the Eastern Front, Hitler wanted to return to Rastenburg, but kept putting it off for some conversion work or other to his barrack hut at FHQ Wolfschanze. Thus, on the 7th of July 1944, we were still at Berchtesgaden, and Hitler went to Schloss Klesheim to see a display of new uniforms. Not until much later did I discover that Brigadier Helmuth Stief had planned an assassination attempt on Hitler that day. These were to be Hitler's last days at the Berghof. As a result of a stupid incident, I had to leave the Obersalzberg much earlier. While out walking with Karl Tennersek, we met a young lady who, after strolling with us a while, invited us to the Berchtesgadener Hof for the afternoon. Karl did not go along. I went alone but had an uneasy feeling about it, not only for that reason, but also because of the presence of some generals there. 2 or 3 tables further on, Hitler's chauffeur Erich Kempka was seated with his wife, the widow of our former colleague, now fallen at the front, Rudi Mummer. She was an attractive woman, and my female companion made a comment about it. Yes, she's beautiful all right, but not for marrying, slipped from my lips. I knew a thing or two about the former Frau Mummer and made the mistake of telling my table companion. My companion then revealed herself to be a secretary at OKH, later the wife of Alfred Jodl. She rang the Berghof from the Berchtesgadener Hof to gossip, and when I got back there, Albert Bormann came up to me at once. "Mish! What's this shit you've stirred up?" he shouted at me. "Kempka is going to speak to the boss tomorrow. See that you're gone." Albert Bormann liked me. I was always resolving this or that private matter he asked me to attend to. He was very grateful to me for taking a gift to his mother. He wanted me to work for him after the war. That was his wish. In this particular case, Albert Bormann had already arranged for me to leave the Berghof the next morning on the regular courier flight at 9, to allow the storm to die down a little. In Berlin, I waited anxiously for the aftermath. Anticipating this, my colleague Biermann rang me the next day from the Berghof. "Don't shit your pants. The marriage is going to be dissolved." On Hitler's instructions, Kempka was already separated from his wife because her past did not conform to the required moral standard. I think Hitler was forced to intervene because it was unlike him to want to get involved in these affairs of passion. Thus he took into his close staff men whom Admiral Raeder had forced out of the Kriegsmarine for conduct unbecoming an officer. A colleague of Bormann, Alwin Broder Albrecht, had been relieved of his post in the Navy after marrying a woman whose morals did not meet the approval of Admiral Raeder. Only a few days after my rushed departure, on the 14th of July 1944, Hitler also left the Berghof. Shortly afterwards, at FHQ Wolfschanze, I had to go to his car to open the passenger door. This brought me into contact with Kempka. He gave me a nod. Forgiven, forgotten. Despite the official enforced separation, he remained in touch with his ex-wife. After the war, she helped him through her contacts with the American occupiers. Then they remarried. With my inglorious retreat from the Obersalzberg, my carefree days at the Berghof ended forever. Not until later did that become clear. The 20th of July 1944. The RSD and the Führer's bodyguard, the SS Begleitkommando, were responsible for the protection of Hitler, the RSD additionally for ministers. The RSD colleagues were almost without exception from Munich, the RSD having been drawn from the Munich detective force. Since 1933, It had been under the command of Johann Rattenhuber, lieutenant of the Bavarian State Police, and by 1944 had a complement of 250 men. Hitler tolerated only one bodyguard in his immediate presence, and this man would be from the SS Begleitkommando. The RSD man appointed for Führer protection had to take up a position some distance away from Hitler and the SS Begleitkommando bodyguard. This resulted ultimately in there being only one pure bodyguard, and he was a rather weak guardian as far as our weapons were concerned. In contrast to my better-equipped RSD colleagues, we carried only the standard small Walther Polizei pistol, PP, of 7.65 caliber, and nothing else. This handgun would be our constant companion, and we never gave it in, not even in the area of the Führer suite. We were not searched, and neither did we conduct searches for weapons. The RSD carried out all necessary controls. The whole arrangement was rather slack. The more important people had their own armed bodyguard, and we would know these individuals as time went on. To all intents and purposes, the Führer suite in the old Reich Chancellery had long been unguarded, the doors at the tradesman's entrance to the Reich Chancellery having only one sentry. I often did duty there myself. Frequently, people one did not know would come in, wanting to speak or visit one of the house staff. In that instance, I would have the staff member telephoned from the front door and advised. It was not unknown for strangers to call by. It would probably not have been difficult to visit one of the staff, disable him with a spray of some kind, and then run up the 22 steps leading from the tradesman's entrance to the Holy of Holies. An intruder would have had a free run, for there was no other sentry. I pointed out to Johann Rattenhuber another possibility once. "Do you bet that somebody couldn't make it from the street to Hitler's bedroom in 2 minutes?" I challenged him. I was thinking of the tradesman's entrance, but also of the situation at the Foreign Ministry. From some of the windows, it was less than 3 meters to the flat of House Administrator Kannenberg in the old Reich Chancellery. All it needed from there was a plank between the buildings, and an acrobat could have made it to the balcony and Hitler's bedroom. One might not believe it, but it was so. The Führer suite was not guarded expressly. I was also very surprised at the security precautions when Hitler drove through Berlin. Some time after the war began, he and his bodyguard would cross the Reich capital in 2 Volkswagens to dine with Magda Goebbels or Inga Ley. In the first, Beetle would be his valet, adjutant, and the driver Kempka. In the other, the driver Martin Schmiedel and 2 of my colleagues. That was the total protection. I have personally seen how a crowd would immediately gather around our cars if for some reason we had to stop for a moment. Then we would have a job to keep people at a distance. On several occasions, Hitler was very annoyed with us for forcing people back too briskly, in his opinion. His security men were always working to introduce functioning security structures. It was down to Hitler himself that there were glaring holes in his personal protection measures. But whenever he was addressed on the matter, he would reply in the most relaxed manner, "Nothing will happen to me." On the late evening of the 19th of July, 1944, I was seated in the courier compartment of the night train from Insterburg to Berlin. I was bringing the Daily Mail bag from FHQ Wolfschanze to the Reich Chancellery. In the train I ate my rations. I had grabbed the specially selected rolls from a nicely built pyramid of bread rolls intended for the participants at the Situation Conference. At first, I did not know how I was going to smuggle them out. By chance, Bussmann was removing a tray from Hitler's study. One of his serviettes was on the tray. Bussmann made a gesture in agreement when I asked him if I could have the serviette. "Sure, we have enough of them." They bore Hitler's initials and were meant for his personal use only. The other serviettes were embroidered with the initials RK for Reichskanzlei, Reich Chancellery. When the Russians arrived, my wife burnt everything that could have been dangerous for us. She forgot the serviette. After I had delivered the mail to Otto Meissner at the Presidential Chancellery in the early morning of the 20th of July, I drove home. In the evening I had to take the night train back to Rastenburg, and I wanted to rest and see my family. A few months previously, on the 11th of April 1944, our daughter Brigitte had been born. Eva Braun had given us a large pile of baby clothes and a pram. "From the stock," she said, playing down her nice gesture when I protested that I could not accept it all. Brigitte's first car ride had been in an official car from the Reich Chancellery motor pool. Gerda had been confined in a mother's home just outside Berlin, and when she was ready to go home with the baby, I heard that one of Albert Bormann's colleagues was driving to a state property north of Berlin. "You will pass the home where my wife is," I told him. The colleague asked Bormann for permission, who had no objections to his picking up my wife and the newborn child. Thus Brigitte was driven in the black Mercedes from the Führer car fleet. The birth of my daughter was a joyful event, but it was around this date, from the spring of 1944, that I began to have a permanent unpleasant feeling. At midday on the 20th of July, I was lying on the living room settee at the house of my parents-in-law, resting after the night train journey. Since Gitte's birth, my wife had been living in Rudau again, to avoid being alone at Karlshorst, and so that her own mother could help with the baby. I had just fallen asleep when the phone rang. Gerda shook me awake. "Okay. Ach, they should leave me in peace," I murmured, still drunk with sleep. "Take it, it's urgent." With a deep sigh, I seized the receiver. I was to go at once to the Reich Chancellery. A car was already on the way to fetch me. What was up, I wanted to know. "This is no time for questions. Get here at once." I got a move on, but had not finished dressing when the car arrived. The Reich Chancellery, the whole government quarter, was surrounded by troops of the Berlin Wachbataillon under Major Otto Ernst Rehmer. There were about 70 men in the Reich Chancellery courtyard. Nobody was entering or leaving. Despite the host of people around, a deathly silence reigned. Somebody arranged for me to be admitted to the telephone switchboard in the old Reich Chancellery, my workplace. 2 colleagues were seated at the switchboard and looked very busy. Rehmer's people were here and there. Some had even penetrated into the Führer suite. An attitude of helplessness prevailed everywhere. I was informed briefly that an attempt had been made to assassinate Hitler. Initially, I could not find out any more. Rehmer was in Goebbels's service villa, and there was no certainty about who was in command. I felt very uneasy about all this. What the hell was going on here? Were they going to start shooting soon? Who was friend, who foe? I looked around me. Rehmer's people looked no less anxious. They stood around indecisively and let my 2 colleagues get on with it. They were phoning round incessantly and needed my help. There was something wrong with the telephone connections to FHQ Wolfschanze. Goebbels insisted several times on being connected to Hitler, and both at the Propaganda Ministry and Reich Chancellery all possible lines had to be checked over to ensure they were working and free of interference. Officially, I was not on duty, being a courier, but my colleagues would not be able to solve the problems quickly, and I knew the telephone switchboard best. "Let me take over," I said as I relieved one of my 2 despairing colleagues. The very modern switchboard did not let us down, and it was possible, partly by circuitous routing, to restore all required lines to FHQ Wolfschanze for Goebbels. Not until later did I learn that the conspirators had blocked off some of the telephone lines. Hitler was alive. He spoke to Goebbels, then Rehmer. "Do you recognize my voice?" he asked the major. Rehmer agreed that he did. Hitler ordered Rehmer to place himself and his battalion under his, therefore Hitler's and Goebbels's personal orders. "You will have to work things out with Goebbels. I cannot undertake anything from here." Thus the phantom was gone. Only minutes later I saw Rehmer in the Reich Chancellery courtyard. Suddenly it grew hectic, and I heard excited shouting, "Schnell! Schnell!" Quicker than it takes to tell, Rehmer took his troops out. The Reich Chancellery was back in our hands. My tension fell away, and I was soon overcome by exhaustion, having been torn from sleep on account of the assassination attempt. In all, I spent only about half an hour at my workplace, and there was time to go to my service quarters and the kitchen to prepare my rations for the journey back. As planned, I was at Berlin-Anhalter station at 2100 HRS to return to FHQ Wolfschanze. That same night, Hitler made a radio broadcast to the people, in which he said that a quite small clique of ambitious, unscrupulous, criminal and stupid officers had wanted to get rid of him. He considered that the failure of the attempted assassination was a sign that he should continue with his life's work as he had done hitherto. I heard about the speech later. I slept most of the time on the night train to Rastenburg. Being so tired, I had hardly given thought to what the location of the attempted assassination of Hitler was going to look like. I reached FHQ Wolfschanze in the early morning hours of the 21st of July. My colleagues gave me an excited report on the previous day's events. The Situation Conference barrack hut was a wreck. An RSD colleague let me through the barriers and led me to the incident scene. The bomb would have killed Hitler had Major General Rudolf Schmundt, the Wehrmacht chief adjutant to Hitler, not lifted Stauffenberg's briefcase, which the latter had placed below the table, and placed it behind himself because his feet kept coming into contact with it. Otto Günscher, who had been hurled through the window by the blast, had observed that and told my colleague Arthur Adam, who repeated it to me. Schmundt had therefore taken most of the blast. Adam had been duty telephonist at the time of the attempt, and it was he who had first identified Stauffenberg as the perpetrator. Adam made his report to Hitler personally, that Stauffenberg had left the conference without retrieving his belt and cap from the cloakroom. The telephonist remembered that Stauffenberg had impressed upon him to have a car ready from the motor pool, but it had not arrived at the required time. As a result of his jitters, which Adam had not observed, however, Stauffenberg must then have forgotten his cap and belt. Once the bomb had gone off, Stauffenberg had succeeded in leaving the Führersperrkreis without any problems, but then he had been stopped at the outer Sperrkreis exit. The colleague who drove him to the airfield told me that when they were stopped at the control post, he had turned off the engine. Stauffenberg had then barked at him to leave the engine running. Stauffenberg wanted to speak to the responsible lieutenant colonel about being stopped, but he was not present, and so he had himself connected to his deputy. Rittmeister Leonhard von Mollendorf finally gave permission for him to proceed. I knew who Stauffenberg was. In the latter days at the Berghof, he had frequently attended situation conferences. Nothing else about him had struck me, apart from his outer disfigurement. We colleagues did not think of him as a would-be assassin of Hitler. An assassin he certainly was, but his assassination attempt was levelled at everybody present in that room in which he had placed the bomb. 4 men 10 had ultimately died because of it, but not Hitler. At the time of the explosion, Stauffenberg would not have been in the conference room, but might have had himself called out to take a telephone call, as often happened. It could have been the way in which things would end for me. I had often imagined it. I report that I have a telephone call for the Führer, and bang, it is over for me. That something could happen to me in the bodyguard, that was obvious. Not for nothing were our lives each assured in the sum of 100,000 Reichsmarks, but that an assassination attempt would be planned in such a way as to make short work of our own men too, that was something we had never thought of. That made Stauffenberg a murderer of his colleagues for us. There was really nothing worse. I had known Rudolf Schmundt since he had been a captain, and I thought a lot of him. I was much affected when he died as a result of his injuries in the military hospital at Rastenburg at the beginning of October. Hitler showed himself to be particularly bitter that Stauffenberg had not shot himself after his plan failed. That was cowardly and unworthy of an officer. With the failure of this assassination attempt, it got through to Hitler's opponents that once more he had proved unconquerable. He felt himself as a person confirmed in his incomparably outstanding importance and believed in providence. His standard retort, "Nothing will happen to me," now had a completely different meaning. In any case, behind the events of the 20th of July there stood a clear exclamation mark. As arranged, Hitler received Mussolini on the day of the assassination attempt. His work had to go on. When I arrived on the 21st of July, everything was proceeding as usual. No especial excitement. I watched the repairs to the barrack hut and talked to the men of the building squad. I briefly befriended one of the workers and established that he came from Silesia. Later, I sent him all the photos that I had taken of him at work repairing the barrack hut. How could I have anticipated that one day a Hollywood film producer would ask me about them? The photographs are now all in Poland with the man's heirs. I kept none back. I did not appear in any of them. Dreadful revenge was taken against the conspirators. After Stauffenberg and some of his co-conspirators had been sentenced to death and executed that same night, Hitler ordered that the remainder should be tried by the People's Court. In the bodyguard we never spoke about these trials. They were things never talked of. It is alleged occasionally nowadays that Hitler asked to see photos of the executions of convicted conspirators. I do not believe that. It was not like him. That was not his concern. To the best of my knowledge, he never looked at pictures of gruesome events, nor could he bring himself to confront human suffering by looking at it directly. If he could avoid it, he would not address such things. Visits to military hospitals and such like were anathema to him. I did not find the situation after the assassination attempt to be particularly changed or tense. We received no new instructions on security precautions, nor were we of the SS Begleit Commando more anxious afterwards, Hitler himself least of all. Nevertheless, more often than before, he would smell conspiracy and treason whenever we had bad news. On one occasion I heard him and Keitel arguing loudly near an open window. I found it difficult to identify which of the two was talking. Their voice tone was very similar. The cause had been an operation in Finland, in which heavy losses had been sustained. This had resulted from wrong information being supplied by the Wehrmacht command staff. Accordingly, Hitler had given the order to advance without the necessary military equipment being to hand. 300 urgently needed field guns were in the harbour at Tallinn and had not been unloaded. Hitler was beside himself. How can something like that happen? How can I give orders if I have not been correctly informed about the situation? I am ultimately responsible for everything.